Today we're going to talk about a very different kind of argument for belief in God. And what we'll see with this argument is that an argument that you ought to believe in God, is different than an argument for God's existence. And what we're going to see today is an example of that, an example that proves that point. That is, it's going to be an argument that we ought to believe in God, but it's not an argument that gives any reason that God exists. It is what we're going to call a pragmatic argument for God's existence. So let's get into that. Okay, so we're talking about pragmatic reasons for belief in God. This guy over here on the right is Blaise Pascal, and again, that's almost surely not the right pronunciation. He was a French philosopher and theologian. He was a Christian, and he gave a very famous pragmatic argument for belief in God. So we need to get clear on this distinction between evidential versus pragmatic reasons for belief. So when we talk about giving, basically all of the arguments we've considered so far, especially those for God's existence, have been giving evidential reasons for belief. They are arguments that purport to give evidence that the belief is true. When we talk about the design argument or the cosmological argument for God's existence, we're giving reasons why you should think that God exists, or reasons why the claim God exists is true. Now, you can give reasons that someone ought to believe in God that are not reasons to think that God exists is true. Okay, those we're going to consider there's at least one class of those reasons, and we're going to call those pragmatic reasons. Reasons for belief that provide evidence that that belief is beneficial to you. Okay, so you don't have reason to think it's true. You do have reason to think that it would benefit you. And on the basis of that reason, you maybe should believe it. So let's give some mundane examples. These are not going to be on the slides. Think about going into a job interview. Now, you could have evidential reasons to think that you'll do well. Maybe you've done a ton of job interviews. I've done a ton of job interviews in my life. And I tend to do pretty well. I'm probably not anywhere close to the best at them. And again, these are just academic interviews, so I probably wouldn't do well, at least immediately, in non-academic interviews. But I have evidence, I have evidential reasons to think that I'll do well in an academic interview, at least. That is, I have data. I can say, look, here's all this data. I've done 18 interviews over the past 3 years. I've done really well on average. I've only done mediocre or poorly once or twice. And I've done really well lots of times. That's data. That data gives me reason to think it's true that I'll do well in this interview coming up, say tomorrow. But I could have a very different kind of reason to think that I'll do well in this interview tomorrow. And that reason could be something like this. I get really nervous about interviews. And when I get nervous, I really screw interviews up usually. But it keeps me from getting nervous if I can convince myself that I'm going to do well. Talk myself up, maybe even watch some hype videos, maybe Shia LaBeouf saying, just do it. And I get hyped and I think I'm going to do really well. I can have that reason. Maybe I actually have done poorly on my interviews before. I actually don't have any good evidential reason, any reason to think it's true that I'm going to do well. But I could still have pragmatic reason. Maybe it's been 3 interviews and I've just realized this about myself. Oh my gosh, it's because I haven't believed in myself enough that I've crashed and burned in these interviews. And now I realizing this about myself, I realize if I just get myself to believe that I'm going to do well, it will kind of be like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I will do well because it will make me less anxious, less nervous. I'll be able to tap into the actual knowledge that I have. I know tons of stuff that I could talk about in an interview. I have really great answers to questions. It's just my nerves that get to me because I think I'm going to not do well. So I could have a reason to believe that I'm going to do well that's not really based on any reasons to think it's true. It's just based on the reason that it would benefit me to think that I'm going to do well. Similarly, let's just do one more example in case that one tripped you up a little bit. You think about this, if you have kids, I mean, we were all kids at one point, so you can at least remember that. But especially if you have kids, you've probably, unless they're really young, had to deal with questions like, what should you do about Santa? What should you do about the tooth fairy? All of these things that, sorry to spoil it for you, are not real. Should you tell your kids that they're real just to let them kind of have the experience? Or should you kind of let them know somehow gently that they're not real, they're just sort of fun, right? My wife and I have taken the latter option. And again, I'm not going to judge anybody for doing differently, but that's neither here nor there. And it does create problems. Again, rabbit trail here, but other people in your family choose to do other things, and then you have to keep your kids from talking to their kids about Santa. And especially when your oldest kid is a super know-it-all and wants to tell everybody that Santa doesn't exist, it gets tricky. However, you can imagine when people give their reasons for like wanting their kids to do Santa, it's never an evidential reason, right? No one ever says, I want my kids to believe in Santa because there's good evidence that he exists. People say, no, I want my kids to believe in Santa because it's fun. What they have are pragmatic reasons for their kids to believe in Santa. It's never evidential, right? It's never, I have evidence that he exists, that the belief is actually true. No, it's evidence that the belief would be beneficial to that kid, right? And actually, the arguments against your kid believing in Santa are both evidential and pragmatic. So people will say, well, there's no evidence that he exists. I don't think you should believe in something that there's no evidence that it's true. So that's an evidential reason to disbelieve in Santa. But other people give pragmatic reasons to disbelieve or to believe that Santa doesn't exist. They'll say, well, it's not because of the evidence that he doesn't exist. It's because it's actually bad for kids to believe in Santa, because they're eventually going to have their dreams crushed. Hopefully I didn't crush your dreams, however old you are. But eventually when they're 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or something like that, I think when I was in school, there was one girl when I was in 5th grade who still believed in Santa. But eventually they're going to have their dreams crushed. It's going to be really rough for them. Maybe you think that there's also value in or value for them, for their benefit, that they can separate truth from fiction, that they don't get cynical about all truth later on in life. Anyway, so those would be, you say, well, it'd be really bad for them to believe in Santa eventually. It might be good for them for a little bit, but it's going to be far worse in the future. And so there we're having evidential and pragmatic reasons against belief in Santa. So again, just to recap there, the Santa case is a really great example. Consider the case for believing in Santa. It's not evidential. It's no one thinks that they want their kids to believe in Santa because there's evidence that the belief is true. What they think is there's evidence that it's good for the kids to believe in Santa. In fact, there's evidence that it's not true, abundant evidence. Okay, so that's the difference between evidential and pragmatic reasons. Now, as I said, all of our arguments for God's existence so far have been evidential reasons to think that God actually exists. But now we're going to consider one argument inspired by Pascal's argument that is an argument that you ought to believe in God just because it would benefit you. It works out in terms of your expected utility. And we're going to talk about expected utility calculations. We're even going to get a little mathy for a second. So hopefully you're not allergic to math. And if you have been wanting philosophy to be a little bit more concrete and technical, then this might be your time to shine. Okay, so here's a decision matrix. We've looked at these with regard to consequentialism and utilitarianism before, and now we're going to look at the same sort of matrix but about belief. So instead of choosing which action to perform, we're choosing which belief to have, or belief or lack of a belief, or belief or, yeah, exactly. So the top row gives us two options. We can either believe in God or not believe in God. The top row gives us are two, or and then these two columns on the right give us our two options for what we can do. We can either believe in God or not believe in God. The God exists versus God doesn't exist give us the sort of structure of reality, right? Either God exists or he doesn't. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at what happens if you believe in God and God doesn't exist. This is the middle rectangle, right? What happens if you don't believe in God and God exists? That's the one to the right. Now jump down a row. What happens if you believe in God and God doesn't exist? What happens if you don't believe in God and God doesn't exist? So these are all of the possibilities with regard to belief in, if we just split between believing in God and not believing in God. It's going to get more complicated than that initially or eventually, but it's not yet. So we want to be able to evaluate. We'll talk a little bit more about why we're doing this in a second. Here we're going to be considering, instead of broad utility for ourselves. So if it's me, I want to know what happens if I believe in God. What is the benefit to me if I believe in God and God exists? What is the benefit to me if I don't believe in God and God exists? What is the benefit to me if I believe in God and God doesn't exist? What is the benefit to me if I don't believe in God and God doesn't exist? Okay, and that's going to tell us eventually which of these things, pragmatically speaking, that is in terms of our own benefit, what would benefit us most, believing in God or not believing in God. So here's the way I think it should work out. Again, taking a really simplistic picture, I'm going to pop off of this for just a second. Taking a very simplistic picture of belief in God. Let's assume there's just the one possibility of a God to believe in. There's not. We'll talk more about that later. And assuming this actually is not entirely simplistic, this is a picture common to most theistic views, that if you believe in God and God does exist, and let's assume that belief in God brings with it all of the actions and lifestyle that on these theistic views, belief in God is supposed to bring with it. You know, on a Judeo-Christian view, there's a whole ethic for how you ought to live from the Old Testament, from the New Testament, if you're a Christian. And let's just assume that belief in God comes with that. There's lots of disagreement in every religion and amongst religions about the benefits of believing in God and living that lifestyle if God does exist. But it's pretty common theme that if God exists, if God exists like you think he exists according to this religion or this view, and you believe in him and behave accordingly, then there's going to be tremendous benefit to you, right? So if you want to take a super simplistic option, one that I'm just picking this because I think there might be the highest likelihood that people are familiar with this view, at least from pop culture, even if you're not religious. A very simplistic, and I think a huge misinterpretation of Christianity is that if you believe in God in the right ways, at least, you'll go to heaven and you'll have infinite bliss, right? So you have infinite happiness if you believe in God and he exists. He does have to exist in order for you to get that infinite bliss, right? Because if you're wrong, then there is no heaven, assuming, and you're just rotting in the ground or something. I think it's a simplistic view. I don't think it's totally off, though. I think a fuller view of the Christian view, of the Jewish view, of the Muslim view would be still maintain that we do have infinite bliss somehow in virtue of believing in God and following that way of life. Not all of these religions save it for the afterlife either. And I think even a proper interpretation of Christianity would do that too. You have benefits even in the current life, even in our current earthly life, from belief in God. They're not infinite, but eventually, you know, those benefits will continue after death and will be infinite. Okay, so that middle square, that middle rectangle, looks like it should probably be infinite utility to me. Because again, the question is, what is the utility for me with the specified belief and the specified outcome? In this case, it's my belief is believe in God. The outcome is God actually exists. That's the way the world is. And looks like the utility for me is infinite, right? I have infinite bliss, infinite happiness if I believe in God and he exists. What if I choose not to believe and God exists? Well, again, we'll move a little faster here. On simplistic views and less simplistic views, maybe on a really simplistic view, you go to hell and you have infinite unhappiness, infinite misery. So if we can assume a sort of quantificational thing here, would be positive infinity in the middle square, and then to the square to the right of it, negative infinity utility, right? Assuming that negative means unhappiness, right? So it'd be negative infinity in the right hand square in the middle of those rows. Again, I think that's probably going to be true of even on less simplistic understandings of different religions. But then again, just to give one kind of complicating factor, there are versions of Judaism, there are versions of Christianity on which, at least within Christianity, there's a view called universalism. This is endorsed by the Eastern Orthodox Church, that eventually hell will be empty if it exists at all, and all will be saved. And so that's a complicating factor, but we can throw that out for just a second. Okay, so we've just looked at what happens if you believe in God and he exists? What happens if you don't believe in God and he exists? Let's look at the last two. What happens if you believe in God and he doesn't exist? Well, I don't know. Let's just take a super simplistic view. Maybe someone could argue, at worst, you get a little bit of disutility. You get a little bit of unhappiness. You're not going to be miserable, right? Because presumably you're never going to find out that he doesn't exist. I mean, if he doesn't exist, and let's assume there's no afterlife because of that, you're going to have no state of knowledge after you die. There's just going to be nothing. So maybe what you lose out is your Sunday mornings, or, that time you spent reading the Bible or the Torah or the Quran or whatever. So maybe that's a little bit of disutility, but I think the believer could come back here and argue, even if they wanted to. They're not going to need to, but if they wanted to, they could argue, yeah, but don't you also get benefits from believing in God even if he doesn't exist? And we could have that argument for a long time. I'm going to show you in a few minutes why we don't need to have that argument. And we can just assume, worst case scenario, you have a little bit of unhappiness, right? You lose out a little bit. Instead of whatever, going and riding your bike on a Sunday morning, you're in church singing boring songs, depending on the church you go to, whatever. Now, so believe in God and God doesn't exist, maybe you get a little bit of unhappiness, whereas you could have had a little bit more happiness. Worst case scenario, again. But what happens if you don't believe in God and God doesn't exist? Again, you get a little bit of happiness as opposed to unhappiness, right? So maybe you get to ride your bike on those Sunday mornings. You don't have to spend your mornings in the study of scripture or whatever, depending on your religion. You get a little bit, and again, that's worst case scenario for the believer. The believer, again, might still argue here, yeah, but I get so much enjoyment out of the study of the scripture, out of singing worship songs in church, out of etc. But again, I'll try to get there quick so that I can show you we don't even need to argue about that. Just assume the worst case scenario, that you actually do get a benefit from not believing in God if he doesn't exist. Okay, so that tells me that the chart should look something like this. And again, on a worst case scenario, that if you believe in God and he exists, you have infinite bliss, infinite happiness. So we're going to characterize that as positive infinity. If you don't believe and God exists, we're going to characterize that as negative infinity. Again, assuming away some of the complications that different religions and different sects of religions cause for us, in that they don't always believe that you get negative infinity utility or total misery forever if you don't believe in God and he exists. Put that up to the side for a second. Believe in God, God doesn't exist. Yeah, worst case scenario, you lose your Sunday mornings and whatever, the time that you spent studying the scripture. Or maybe, again, just to throw something new out there, maybe you refrained from doing something because of the ethical constraints of your religion, whereas you would have really enjoyed doing that thing. So maybe your sexual ethics, which that's like one of the most kind of in your face, obvious ways that the ethical codes of religious people and non-religious people differ. Maybe you have restrained yourself sexually because of your religion, whereas you would have enjoyed doing something more, or let's just say less restrained for now. So yeah, worst case scenario, again, I think true religious people are going to argue that those ethical constraints are actually liberating, And so they could argue about this, but worst case scenario, you lose some utility. You're unhappy, but we're talking about a finite amount of unhappiness. It's very rare that religion makes someone utterly miserable for their whole life. So we're going to characterize that as negative 100 utility for you. If you don't believe and God doesn't exist, you get, let's call it positive 100. You get to do all of those things that you would like to do. And again, worst case scenario, this is putting aside the disagreement about whether religious ethics are liberating or not. We're going to assume that they're not, that they're overly restrictive or something like that, just for the sake of argument. But even still, again, assuming, this is why we don't have to worry about, assuming the worst case scenario for the believer and about the restrictiveness of their ethics and their behavior and way of life, it still comes out that we need to evaluate the total columns here, right? So what we would normally do here is we'd say, well, what we need to do is take each action and subtract the disutility from the utility and see what happened and see what the result is and pick the one with the highest amount of utility. But here, the way infinity works, just in terms of math, is it kind of swamps any other additions or subtractions, or any other finite additions or subtractions at the very least. And so you subtract 100 from infinity, you still have infinity, if that's even an operation you can do with infinity. But somehow, at any rate, infinity is going to swamp any finite negative unhappiness. So you still end up with belief in God giving you an expected utility of positive infinity, and disbelief in God causing you or giving you a negative utility, or negative infinite amount of happiness, or so utter misery, infinite misery, so to speak. So it turns out, using this utility calculus, which I'm going to kind of go into more depth in here in just a second, you should choose to believe in God, because regardless of whether he exists or doesn't exist, you are going to benefit in the long run, right? You still should, if you believe in God and he exists, great. You get this huge benefit. So just let's back up and look at this from, like, instead of, you might be getting bogged down in the numbers here and in the matrix, and maybe you're not a mathy person, but here's the big picture view here and what this matrix is trying to represent. You're trying to choose between two things, right? And one is, if you win huge. If you lose small. If you do the other thing, winning wins small, but if you lose huge, right? Which one should you do? You should do the one that if you win huge, and if you lose small. Not the one that if you lose huge, and if you win small, right? So if you were asked to make a bet, for example, where, let's say you're choosing between making one of two bets. You're going to make one or the other. And one, it's going to get more complicated than this, because we have to consider the odds on the bets and or the odds of the outcomes and things like that. But if in the abstract, if you have to choose between a bet on which you put up $10 and at most you'll lose $10, but you could make $1,000 if you win, versus a bet on which you have to put up $1,000 and you could easily lose that $1,000, and if you win, you only win $10, well, then you should choose the first bet, obviously, at least not taking into account the odds of the result happening. And we'll take that into account in just a second. But in the abstract, it looks like you should pick the one on which you stand to win huge and lose only a little bit, over the option on which you stand to lose huge and win only a little bit, right? So it's like sort of hedging your bets, almost like spend the time in church or reading the scripture or whatever, because the win ratio, or the sort of the odds here, are in your favor. If you win huge. If you lose, you just lose a little bit. Now, again, some of y'all might be thinking this is a super cynical argument for belief in God, and maybe it is. We'll talk about that later, but it's still worth talking about, and I'll talk about why it might not be such a cynical argument later. But let's get into the utility calculus that's behind this first. So I said we weren't taking into account yet the odds of the outcome happening, but now, of course, we need to take into account those odds. So the way that we standardly do a utility calculus is you consider your two options. You consider the utility that could result from one and the utility that could, you take each option in by itself, right? If you're choosing between A and B, those are your two choices of action. and you want to know, what should I do just in terms of the benefit to me? Well, you don't just want to know, this is why this chart is a little too simplistic. You don't want to just know the utility that could result from each action, right? Because again, take the betting case, right? If I have to choose between putting up $1 and if I lose the $1, if I win 10, or putting up $10 and if I win, I only make $1, if I lose all $10. Well, we don't have enough information yet to know what we should bet on, right? Because if the one on which I put up $1, but I could win $10, if I only win, if some really unlikely thing happens, I'm putting up $1 betting that Stephen F. Austin State University will be the best football program in the nation next year. That's not going to happen. That's a stupid bet. Even though I would win $10 and only lose $1 if I lost, still a really stupid bet, because it's just the odds of it happening are so bad, I'm almost surely going to lose that dollar. But if I have to put up $10 in order to win $1, that could still be a good bet if the outcome that I'm betting on is really, really likely, right? So if, the Dallas Cowboys are going to play my high school football team, and I'm betting on the Cowboys to win, and if I have to put up $10, and if they do win, I win $1, I should make that bet every single day, right? Because the odds of it happening are so high. So similarly, when we want to do a calculation of what's in our best interest, we can't just take into account what we would get if it happened, right? And what we would lose if it didn't happen. We have to take into account the probability of getting that benefit and the probability also of getting that bad thing. So the way it works is this. I'm choosing between A and B. How much utility would I get if I got the happiness that I could get out of option A? Multiply that times the probability of that utility happening if I make this decision. And then just do the exact same thing for the other option. If I choose B, what happiness and what unhappiness is going to result or could possibly result, and what's the probability of that happiness or unhappiness resulting. And then when I get both of those numbers, I just compare them and I pick whichever action has the highest number. So let me give you an example. This is like really abstract. I've even got, equations with variables and crap here. Suppose you're in this situation. It's mildly autobiographical. You can choose to go to grad school for philosophy or work as a contractor. Let's assume you just graduated as a double major in philosophy and, construction something or other, whatever, obviously contractors don't have to have degrees, but whatever degree would be great for a contractor. So it turns out you really like both things. You like philosophy a little bit more. Here's the thing. If you go to grad school in philosophy, your ultimate dream, you're really only winning, you're really only getting what you want if you get to work as a philosophy professor. But it turns out the odds of getting a job as a philosophy professor, even if you do grad school and all this stuff, are really low. This is actually true. And if you decide to go the contractor route, you're actually very likely to get a job with no grad school. Maybe you know a guy, you have contacts. My brother-in-law, for example, is a contractor. Maybe if I'm considering this, I could just go to him and say, what should I do? And he could tell me, I could probably get you a job, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so what this tells us is, so what we want to know is, what should I do if my only concern was maximizing my expected happiness? What should I do? Well, we need to do, what would be the utility of working as a philosophy professor? Well, it'd be 100, let's call it, right? It's a little bit higher than the utility that I'd get as working as a contractor. But what's the probability that I get that utility if I take this route of studying philosophy? We're going to call it 0.1. That represents 10%. We just need something. You could multiply by 10 too if you wanted, but I'm just using the scale of 0 to 1 as the scale of 0 to 100%. Okay, so 0.1 represents 10% probability of getting a job as a philosophy professor if I choose to study philosophy. So the result is 10. Okay, 10 units of expected utility. Like I said, I enjoy contracting work a little bit less than doing philosophy. So if I got a job as a contractor, it would be 90 units of happiness. But let's say I've got a really good chance of getting that job if I choose to go that route, like a 90% chance. So that here represented as 0.9, multiply the two together and you get 81. Well, the last step was just pick the one with the highest number. So if I'm in this situation and I really do enjoy contracting almost as much as I enjoy philosophy, but I'm way more likely to get a job as a contractor than as a philosopher. If I'm just out for my own self-interest and that was my only concern, I should absolutely, it's not even close, absolutely choose to work as a contractor or choose to try to get a job as a contractor in this situation. That's how expected utility works. You take the utility that would result from each action, multiply it times the probability of that utility happening, and then pick the bigger number. And that's how we got, so if we were to apply that, that is, that same utility calculus to this chart didn't take into account the probability of God existing or not existing, right? This is where we ended here. But none of this took into account the probability of getting the infinite utility, which would be the probability of God existing. Neither did it take into account the probability of getting the disutility if we believe in God, which would be the probability of God not existing. Well, so now we have to establish what is the probability that God exists? That is, what is the probability that if I believe in God, I'm going to get that infinite utility? Or if I don't believe, I'm going to get infinite misery. Well, that's hard to determine, right? What is the probability that God exists? What is the probability that God doesn't exist? That's hard to determine. Here's why we don't have to answer this question, though, because when you're dealing with infinite utility and infinite misery, as long as it's not impossible for God to exist, our utility calculus is still going to tell us that we should believe in God. Because take any non-zero probability and multiply it times infinity, and you still get infinity. So our expected utility is still going to be infinity if we believe in God and negative infinity if we don't believe in God. And so as long as God's existence is not impossible, and I don't think it is, then we should still believe in God, right? If you've bought in so far. Okay, so we're pretty far down the rabbit hole here. Let's talk about just two problems for this form of argument. First is there are not only two options, right? Our little decision matrix here said there were two options, believe in God or don't believe in God. But again, there's so many different options for belief. You could believe in the God of Judeo-Christianity with or without Jesus. You could believe in Allah, you could believe in Brahman, you could believe in Buddha. Then there's complicated questions about whether, there was an academic debate recently about whether Muslims and Christians and Jews all worship the same God or whether we should think of them as different gods. It gets super complicated. There's tons of religions, tons of different gods. If you go to Hinduism, then we're not even talking about a single God. We're talking about lots of different gods. And how do you apportion your belief there? And so basically what this just means is that our decision matrix would get crazy complicated. And we'd have to, we could still do the calculation, figure out what all the different gods are that we could believe in and what the benefit of believing in each one would be if that God actually existed, and what the drawback would be of believing in that God if that God didn't exist. And then we'd also have to figure out the probability of each God existing, right? It's a 16% chance that Brahman exists. It's a 12% chance that the God of Christianity is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it would just get really complicated. So that's one problem with the argument. A second problem that people bring up just as frequently is whether you can really choose to believe something. Remember, I told y'all we're going to talk about a decision matrix. What this matrix is it's trying to represent how you should make a decision and the expected utility from each option. And like I said, we used this when we talked about utilitarianism, trying to determine the overall utility, not just the utility for me, of two different actions and compare them. And that made sense because I can certainly choose how to act, right? Whether to donate money, whether to withhold money, whether to spend the money on going to the movies or not. But then we tried here to apply the same sort of calculations about how to determine what to do to beliefs. And you might wonder, I don't really choose to believe the things that I choose or that I believe in the same way that I choose to act. I can choose to pick up this cup, right? I can choose to take this pen and write down a note. Can I choose to believe something right now? Well, let me give you a crazy case. I certainly can't choose to believe that there's an elephant outside this window. The window is open. I can see outside of it. Even if it was closed, I couldn't just choose to believe it. I could say it. I could choose to say it, but that's an action. That's not my belief, right? I couldn't choose to get myself to actually believe that there was an elephant out there, regardless of whether the window was open or closed, because there's just no elephants in Cleburne that I know of. It's very unlikely that one would be in my front yard. And similarly, with other kinds of belief, even less probable things. Could I just get myself to believe that my wife is in the backyard right now? No, I can't. I just don't have any evidence for it, right? So you might wonder, this sort of calculation doesn't make sense for things that you have no control over. You can't choose to believe in God, so we shouldn't talk about, it doesn't make sense to talk about the expected utility of believing in God or not believing in God. However, I think there is a better answer to this sort of objection. I think we have more control over what we believe than we'd like to think. Here's why. It would not, certainly not direct control. I have direct control over whether I pick up this pen. Okay, look, I'm deciding right now and I picked it up. I do not have direct control over what I believe. I do, however, have indirect control over lots of things that I believe. And here's how. I can have long-term indirect control over certain things that I believe just by choosing whether or not and how to go seeking evidence, right? I could, if I really wanted to, I could maybe, or I could at least get closer to believing in flat Earth theory. I don't think I could, I might not at this point be able to get myself to wholeheartedly believe it, but I could get closer to believing it just by ignoring certain evidence and focusing on other evidence. I could ignore, actually, you know what? We do this all the time. We do it more and more as social media comes to inform more about our how we receive news. You could probably go find the polls if you wanted to. More and more people over the last decade or so have been using social media platforms as their primary source of news. The problem that this causes, if you've heard about it, is called echo chambers. What happens is people start to click away from, or sort of, what's the word? You can decide which news sources you're hearing from on social media, and social media's algorithms can actually predict what you'll want to see and what you won't want to see. So essentially you're being very selective in the evidence that you're looking at. So if you're talking about political news, you have some control, and then the AI algorithms behind social media have some control over whether it's a right-leaning or left-leaning news source that you view. So if you're selective, if you're clicking away, choosing not to view the stuff that disagrees with your viewpoint, you are choosing to focus on certain kinds of evidence and ignore other kinds of evidence. And in that way, you are actually exercising indirect control over your own beliefs, right? Because if you didn't do that, if you said, I'm liberal leaning, I'm going to ignore the Fox News stuff, I'm only going to focus on the stuff from CNN and MSNBC, etc., you're going to end up with more liberal views. If you said instead, I'm going to not listen to that stuff, I'm just going to look at Fox News and other conservative news outlets, you would end up probably, maybe not as a sure thing, but you'd end up very probably with more conservative views. And similarly, so that's the sort of long-term indirect influence we have over our own beliefs. So take that and apply it to Pascal's argument. Do we have enough control over our belief in God that it would make sense to talk about the expected utility of believing or not believing? And I think yes, right? There are strong arguments for belief in God, and then there are strong arguments that God doesn't exist. And if you really wanted to believe in God, you could choose to ignore or at least read really good responses to the arguments against God's existence, and really focus on the best sorts of arguments for God's existence. And similarly, if you wanted to disbelieve in God, you could really focus on the most powerful expressions of the problem of evil and choose not to read the best theistic philosophers who are defending belief in God. And this actually happens a lot. We just generally have this bias in favor of our own beliefs. We tend to focus on the best arguments for our belief that we currently hold, and on the worst arguments for the competing belief. So we do have some indirect control over what we believe. So it might make sense to compare the expected utilities of belief in God versus disbelief in God. Now, I think that's where I'm going to stop. This video is really long at this point. Maybe I should have broken it up, but the point here is Pascal and others have given us pragmatic reasons to believe in God. Now, it's true that it gets a little bit more complicated than just believe in God or don't believe in God, but it's not in principle something that you couldn't figure out. It would just be a much more complicated matrix. And furthermore, it seems like you do have some amount of control over what you believe, so that talking about the expected utility of one belief over the other actually makes sense, right? You actually could figure out which one would be better for you, adjusted for the probability of each, and decide to believe or disbelieve. Okay, so that's just food for thought, and I will talk to y'all next time.